3 weeks earlier, after months of disappointing neurological evaluations, Adrian's specialist quietly recommended one final consultation outside the city's private hospital network. The referral came from Dr. Nolan Pierce, a physician known for treating patients whose emotional responses sometimes returned long before their memories did. Victor Hale personally arranged the appointment, convinced that another specialist would simply confirm what every previous examination had already concluded, that Adrian's lost memories would never return. Adrian accepted without argument. He expected nothing more than another routine medical evaluation. Neither man imagined the quiet coastal clinic would lead him back to the one person his heart had never truly forgotten. Sometimes the cruelest thing fate can steal isn't your life. It's the memory of the one person who never stopped loving you. Caleb Monroe had spent the last 4 months convincing himself that ghosts were easier to survive than miracles. Ghosts never knocked on your door, never looked into your eyes with perfect indifference, and never made your heart believe for one impossible second that everything broken could somehow become whole again. Miracles did. They arrived without warning, wearing tailored black coats, surrounded by silent bodyguards, and carrying empty eyes that no longer remembered your name. The rain had been falling since dawn, painting the quiet coastal town in silver reflections. The small family clinic where Caleb worked stood at the end of Harbor Street, squeezed between a bakery and an old bookstore that smelled faintly of cedar whenever the wind shifted inland. It was peaceful here, almost forgotten by the rest of the country, exactly the kind of place someone disappeared to when they wanted the past to stop chasing them. Caleb had chosen it for that reason. He balanced a stack of patient files against one arm, while the other instinctively rested over the gentle curve beneath his sweater. For months, every morning the tiny heartbeat growing inside him reminded him that hope could exist even after everything else had fallen apart. He had promised himself this child would never inherit fear. Outside, tires rolled slowly across rain-soaked pavement. At first he ignored them. Expensive vehicles occasionally passed through town, usually tourists heading toward waterfront estates farther south. But these cars stopped directly in front of the clinic. Caleb looked up absent-mindedly. Then the world stopped breathing. 3 black SUVs waited silently beneath the gray sky. Men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the street with practiced caution before opening the rear passenger door. A tall Alpha emerged with calm confidence, adjusting the cuff of his charcoal overcoat as rain collected briefly on dark hair before sliding away. Adrian Blackwell. Caleb forgot how to inhale. Every forgotten promise, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer returned at once with terrifying clarity. Adrian was alive. He looked exactly as Caleb remembered: strong shoulders, composed expression, silver-gray eyes that had once softened whenever they found him across a crowded room. Those same eyes now carried nothing familiar at all. Caleb's fingers tightened unconsciously against his sweater. His pulse pounded so loudly he barely heard the receptionist greet the unexpected visitors. Adrian entered with measured steps, his presence filling the modest waiting room despite the complete absence of raised voices or dramatic gestures. Patients instinctively glanced toward him before returning to their magazines, unaware they were sharing space with one of the most influential men in organized business and private security circles, a man whose reputation inspired equal measures of respect and caution. Caleb lowered his gaze, willing his expression into something ordinary. He repeated the same thought again and again. Don't look at him. Don't let him recognize you. Don't let yourself believe. Footsteps approached the reception desk. Adrian spoke first. His voice was steady, controlled, deeper than memory, yet painfully familiar. I'm looking for Dr. Nolan Pierce. The receptionist smiled politely. He'll be available in about 10 minutes, sir. Adrian nodded once. Then silence settled over the room. Caleb prayed it would remain that way. Fate ignored prayers. Adrian turned slightly, his attention drifting across the waiting room before settling unexpectedly on Caleb. For reasons neither of them understood, time hesitated. Caleb forced himself to continue organizing paperwork despite every instinct begging him to run. Adrian studied him with quiet curiosity, not recognition, only the strange hesitation someone experiences when confronted with an unexplainable feeling. Something about the scent lingering faintly in the air, warm vanilla touched by winter pine from the rain outside, pulled gently at the edges of his thoughts. A brief ache settled behind his scar, hidden beneath neatly combed hair. His fingers rose instinctively to the place without conscious thought. Caleb noticed the movement immediately. His heart broke all over again. The accident had left more than a scar. It had stolen every shared sunrise, every whispered promise, every dream they had built together. Adrian walked closer, stopping a respectful distance away. His expression remained courteous, almost apologetic. "Excuse me," he said calmly. "Have we met before?" Caleb looked directly into those familiar eyes for the first time in months. They reflected absolutely nothing back. No love, no memory, no home, only polite uncertainty. Somewhere beneath his trembling hand, their unborn child shifted softly, as though sensing the impossible distance, standing only a few feet away. Caleb swallowed carefully, forcing every shattered piece of himself behind one quiet answer. "No," he said with a gentle smile that concealed an entire lifetime of grief. "I don't believe we have." Adrian held Caleb's gaze for another second, as if waiting for an invisible answer that refused to arrive. The quiet uncertainty in his silver-gray eyes lingered before he finally offered a courteous nod. "My apologies," he said. "I must have mistaken you for someone else." Caleb returned a polite smile that felt impossibly heavy. "It happens more often than people think." Adrian stepped away, yet something in his measured stride seemed slower than before. His hand drifted once again toward the faint scar hidden beneath his dark hair. The dull ache behind his temple had returned without warning. It was never strong enough to concern his physicians, but always strange enough to leave him unsettled. Since the accident nearly a year earlier, fragments of sensations occasionally surfaced without explanation. A melody he could not identify. The scent of warm vanilla. The feeling that someone important had once stood exactly where a stranger now stood. None of it made sense. Before either of them could speak again, the clinic door opened. A sharply dressed man in a navy suit entered with effortless confidence. Victor Hale carried himself with the calm precision of someone accustomed to standing just behind powerful people while quietly influencing every important decision they made. His expression remained pleasant until his eyes landed on Caleb. For the briefest moment, something cold flashed beneath his practiced smile before disappearing completely. "Mr. Blackwell," Victor said warmly, walking toward Adrian. "Dr. Pierce is ready whenever you are." Adrian nodded but continued looking toward Caleb for another quiet moment. "Strange," he murmured. "I feel as though I should know him." Victor followed Adrian's line of sight with calculated indifference. "Memory plays tricks after severe trauma. The specialists warned you about that. Familiar faces often become attached to emotions that no longer have names." Adrian considered the explanation. It sounded reasonable. Even so, something inside him resisted accepting it so easily. Victor lowered his voice slightly. "People notice who you pay attention to. It is better not to encourage unnecessary curiosity." Caleb pretended to organize patient folders while listening carefully. Victor's words sounded protective on the surface, yet every sentence subtly pushed Adrian away from his own instincts. It was almost invisible unless someone already knew how carefully Victor chose every word. Adrian finally allowed himself to be led toward Dr. Pierce's office. Just before disappearing through the hallway, he paused again. He looked back only once. Caleb had already lowered his eyes, gently resting one hand against his sweater as another small flutter reminded him he was no longer alone. Adrian frowned almost imperceptibly. There it was again. That same quiet pull he could neither explain nor ignore. Minutes later, Dr. Nolan Pierce welcomed Adrian into his office for a routine neurological evaluation. The examination progressed normally until Adrian mentioned the unfamiliar man in the waiting room. "Did seeing him trigger another headache?" Dr. Pierce asked. "Not exactly," Adrian replied thoughtfully. "It felt more like recognizing a song without remembering the lyrics." The doctor made a brief note before responding carefully. Recovery after traumatic memory loss rarely follows a straight line. Sometimes emotions return before facts do. Sometimes neither returns at all. Adrian accepted the answer, but it brought little comfort. Across the hallway, Caleb quietly gathered his belongings after finishing the morning paperwork. Harper Monroe called him from outside the clinic to check on him after another prenatal appointment had been scheduled for later that week. Caleb reassured his younger sister that everything was fine, carefully hiding the tremble in his voice. As he ended the call, he glanced toward Dr. Pierce's closed office door. He had promised himself never to step back into Adrian's world. That promise had protected both him and the child growing beneath his heart. Yet after seeing Adrian alive, breathing, and searching unknowingly for pieces of a forgotten life, walking away suddenly felt far more difficult than staying hidden. Behind another office door, Victor quietly studied Adrian's medical file while the doctor briefly left to retrieve additional paperwork. The pages confirmed exactly what Victor wanted to see. Significant memory loss. No spontaneous recovery. No identifiable emotional anchors. Victor closed the folder with quiet satisfaction before anyone noticed he had opened it. As Adrian emerged from the examination room a few minutes later, Victor adjusted his tie and spoke with reassuring confidence. "You have an important meeting tomorrow in Portland. There is no reason to return to this little town again." Adrian looked once more toward the now empty waiting room. For reasons he could not explain, the silence felt unexpectedly disappointing. "Perhaps," he answered quietly, "but I do not think this place is finished with me yet." 1 year earlier, before the accident stole every ordinary promise we had ever made, Adrian Blackwell and I had already begun building a quiet life that belonged only to us. It did not begin with grand declarations or impossible vows. It began with coffee left on my desk before sunrise, lunch breaks that somehow matched his schedule too often to be coincidence, and late evenings when the executive floor emptied until only the hum of computers and the glow of city lights remained. To the world, Adrian was the calm alpha at the center of Blackwell Holdings, the man who could silence a boardroom with one look and turn collapsing negotiations into signed agreements before anyone realized they had lost. To me, he slowly became the man who forgot to eat when he worked too hard, who kept 3 unread novels beside his bed because he claimed he would finish them someday, and who looked almost embarrassed whenever I caught him doing something kind and pretending it had been accidental. After the containment incident that first brought us close, he never treated what happened between us as a mistake. He did not pull me into public view or hide me in shame. Instead, he created small spaces where we could simply exist without titles pressing between us. Some evenings he appeared outside the legal department, holding 2 paper bags from the sandwich shop across the street, and said, "You forgot lunch again." I would answer, "I've been busy," and he would smile as though he had been waiting all day for that excuse. On Fridays, when the city lights turned gold beneath the sunset, we sometimes escaped to the rooftop garden above the office, where the wind softened the noise below and made even Blackwell Holdings feel less like a fortress. I still remember him standing beside the glass railing with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking at the skyline as if it belonged to someone else. "When I was younger," he said quietly, "I thought success meant becoming impossible to replace." I asked him what he believed now. He looked at me then, not like a CEO studying a legal assistant, but like a man finally brave enough to admit how tired he was. "Now I think success means having someone waiting for you when you finally decide to go home." I should have looked away. I should have remembered the difference between us, the company, the family name, and the danger of believing powerful men could choose anything softer than power. But when Adrian reached for my hand with such careful tenderness, all the warnings I had lived by became quiet. Over the months that followed, we found excuses to leave the city whenever his schedule allowed. We drove along the coast without bodyguards when he could manage it, stopping at small cafes where nobody recognized him and bookstores where he bought more books than either of us could carry. Once, during a rainy afternoon in a tiny seaside restaurant, I watched him try to help the owner slice vegetables for a charity dinner and nearly destroy an entire cucumber before I took the knife away from him. He looked offended for 3 full seconds before laughing so openly that the old woman running the kitchen declared him hopeless and assigned him to washing plates instead. That night, as we sat outside beneath a striped awning watching rain blur the ocean into silver, Adrian told me he wanted a different kind of future. Not tomorrow, not immediately, but someday. A small house near the water. Mornings that began with coffee instead of emergency calls. A garden neither of us knew how to maintain. A kitchen where he promised, with no evidence to support him, that he would eventually learn to cook. I teased him for planning too far ahead, but he only smiled and touched my hand beneath the table. "Every time I imagine the future," he said, "you're already there." Later that autumn, Adrian asked me to spend an afternoon at Blackwell Manor instead of meeting by the coast. He claimed there was something important he wanted my opinion on, though judging from the unusually serious expression on his face, I suspected it had very little to do with business. The manor felt strangely peaceful that day. Most of the executive staff had already left for an overseas conference, leaving the enormous house wrapped in a silence I had rarely experienced. He led me into his private study overlooking the gardens, where a slim leather portfolio rested neatly on the desk beside two untouched cups of coffee. "Before you ask," he said with a faint smile, "this isn't company business." I opened the portfolio anyway. Several legal documents had already been prepared, each bearing Adrian's signature, but waiting for one final review. At first I assumed they were estate planning papers. Then I noticed the beneficiary section. My name. I looked back at him in complete surprise. He remained standing beside the window, his hands resting quietly inside his pockets. "You once told me that every important contract should protect the people who matter most," he said. I finally realized I had spent years protecting everyone except the person I wanted beside me. I lowered the paper slowly, my heart suddenly too full for words. "Adrian." He crossed the room until he stood beside me. "If anything ever happens to me," he said gently, "I never want you to depend on anyone else's kindness. I don't care what happens to my position, my company, or my name. I only care that you'll always have a safe place to live, proper medical care, and the freedom to choose your own future." I laughed softly through the tears gathering in my eyes. "You're planning for disasters that may never happen. I hope they never do." He smiled. But hope has never been a substitute for responsibility. Together we spent the next hour reviewing every page. I corrected several legal phrases, suggested clearer trust provisions, and reorganized two financial clauses that I thought could create unnecessary tax complications. Adrian accepted every suggestion without hesitation. "You realize," I teased, "I'm making your lawyers look very expensive." He laughed. "They're excellent lawyers." "Then why ask me?" He reached across the table and quietly covered my hand with his own. "Because you're the only opinion I trust more than theirs." When the final page had been signed, he carefully placed the documents inside a dark navy envelope marked Private Trust Authorization before locking it inside his briefcase. Just as he closed the case, a quiet knock sounded at the office door. "Come in," Adrian called. Victor Hale entered carrying several board reports beneath one arm. He offered me the same polite smile he always wore. "Good afternoon, Mr. Monroe." "Good afternoon." Victor placed the reports on Adrian's desk before his eyes briefly settled on the navy envelope disappearing inside the briefcase. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. "The paperwork has finally been completed?" he asked casually. Adrian looked mildly surprised. "You noticed?" Victor smiled. "You've been working on it for weeks. I assumed it was something important." "It is," Adrian replied simply. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Victor inclined his head with quiet understanding. "Then I'm glad you've finally taken care of it." Nothing about his expression appeared unusual. Nothing about his voice sounded suspicious. Looking back now, I often wondered whether everything that followed had quietly begun with that single glance. A few minutes later, Victor excused himself to prepare for the following day's executive meeting. After Victor left, Adrian slipped the briefcase beneath his desk with an amused shake of his head. "He worries too much," he said. "Sometimes I think Victor believes the company would collapse if I disappeared for a weekend." I smiled. "Maybe that's because you've spent years making yourself impossible to replace." Adrian walked toward me, gently brushing a loose strand of hair away from my forehead. "That's exactly what I don't want anymore." His phone vibrated before I could answer. The smile slowly faded from his face as he looked at the screen. An urgent call from the research division. He answered immediately, listening in complete silence before quietly saying, "I'm on my way." When the call ended, he looked genuinely disappointed. "I have to go." "Then go. I'll make it up to you." I laughed softly. "You always say that." He stepped closer, kissed my forehead with familiar tenderness, then rested his hand lightly against mine. "I'll see you tonight." I watched him disappear through the office doors carrying the briefcase that contained every promise we had just planned together. At the time, I did not realize I was watching the last ordinary evening we would ever share before fate rewrote both of our lives. Several days later, Victor Hale quietly came to see me. His expression carried the same calm professionalism I had always trusted. He lowered a sealed medical folder onto the table before speaking. Adrian survived the accident, he said softly, but the damage to his brain is far worse than anyone expected. The specialist cannot promise that he will ever wake up, or that, if he does, he will remember the life he left behind. He paused before meeting my eyes again. I know this is difficult to hear, Caleb, but you cannot keep waiting for someone who may never come back to you. The words shattered everything I still wanted to believe. Later that same afternoon, Dr. Pierce asked me to remain after a routine examination. His expression was unusually gentle as he placed the medical report in front of me. Caleb, he said quietly, you're pregnant. For several long moments, I simply stared at the report without speaking. The only future Adrian and I had dreamed of together now existed inside me. A week later, unable to bear living among places that reminded me of promises we would never keep, I quietly accepted Dr. Pierce's recommendation to begin a new position at Harbor Clinic along the northern coast. Harper came with me without hesitation. I believed I had buried my entire future beside the man I loved. I never imagined fate would one day bring him back to me, alive. Life at Harbor Clinic gradually settled into a quiet routine, and I convinced myself that the past had finally stopped chasing me. The rain finally stopped the following morning, leaving Harbor Street wrapped in cool ocean air that carried the scent of salt and fresh cedar. Caleb arrived at the clinic before sunrise, grateful for the quiet hours before patients filled the waiting room. Numbers had always calmed him. They never lied, never forgot, and never abandoned the truth simply because it became inconvenient. While Dr. Nolan Pierce prepared examination rooms, Caleb settled behind the accounting desk with a cup of warm tea and opened several financial reports connected to the clinic's charitable foundation. His work normally consisted of balancing invoices and organizing donations, but one name buried inside a routine transfer immediately caught his attention. Blackwell Holdings. The contribution had arrived every month for nearly 11 months, always through different subsidiaries, always anonymously. Caleb frowned. Adrian had never mentioned supporting this clinic. Curious, he requested archive transaction records from the secure storage server. As columns of numbers appeared across the monitor, a pattern slowly emerged. Each donation had originated from a private trust established just days before Adrian's accident. The beneficiary description contained only 2 initials. C.M. Caleb felt his heartbeat quicken. His own initials. His fingers hovered above the keyboard as he carefully opened the trust documentation. Most identifying information had been encrypted, but one authorization code remained visible. Caleb recognized it immediately. Years earlier, Adrian had insisted every important document between them include the same sequence of numbers, the date they first promised they would build a peaceful future together away from endless negotiations and dangerous responsibilities. Adrian had hidden that promise inside official financial records where almost no one would ever think to look. Tears gathered in Caleb's eyes, but he forced himself to continue reading. The trust instructed quarterly payments to support relocation expenses, medical care, housing, and education for one protected beneficiary should unforeseen circumstances prevent Adrian from providing those things personally. There was no formal name attached, only the initials and a handwritten digital note preserved inside the encrypted file. Protect what matters most. Caleb covered his mouth, overwhelmed by the quiet certainty that Adrian had planned for his safety long before everything fell apart. He had not been abandoned. He had been protected. Someone had simply erased the bridge leading back to him. At that moment, Harper arrived carrying breakfast from the bakery next door. She noticed the tears before Caleb could hide them. "What happened?" she asked softly, setting the paper bag onto the desk. Caleb turned the monitor toward her. Harper read silently, then looked back at her brother with wide eyes. "He remembered you before the accident," she whispered. "More than remembered. He prepared for you." Caleb nodded slowly. "Which means someone wanted to make certain he never found this again." Harper glanced nervously toward the clinic windows. "You think that man yesterday, Victor?" Caleb closed the document before answering. "I do not know yet. But if Adrian made these arrangements willingly, then the story everyone believes cannot be the whole truth." He spent the rest of the morning tracing every transfer connected to the trust. The money had traveled through several shell companies before reaching the clinic's foundation, carefully disguised as routine charitable giving. Whoever organized the structure understood finance almost as well as Caleb himself. Yet every complicated system left tiny fingerprints. By lunchtime, he identified a final authorization completed less than 24 hours before the accident. Adrian himself had approved it personally. There was no evidence of regret, coercion, or hesitation. Every signature reflected deliberate intent. Caleb leaned back in his chair, his hand instinctively resting over the gentle movement beneath his sweater. "Your father never stopped choosing us," he whispered quietly. "He just does not remember that he already did." Outside the clinic, a black sedan rolled slowly past before disappearing around the corner. Caleb barely noticed it. Inside the vehicle, Victor lowered a pair of sunglasses after spotting Caleb through the front window. He had expected the clinic visit to become nothing more than a forgotten interruption. Instead, Adrian had mentioned the quiet accountant twice during the drive home and once again over breakfast that morning. Curiosity was becoming dangerous. Victor watched Caleb through the windshield for another moment before making a brief phone call. "Delay tomorrow's Portland meeting," he said calmly. "I want additional information about the accountant working at Harbor Clinic. Everything. His background, his finances, and every person he speaks with." As the call ended, Victor looked toward the clinic one final time. Hidden truths had a way of resurfacing when intelligent people started asking careful questions. He intended to ensure that never happened. Inside, Caleb quietly copied every financial record onto an encrypted drive, unaware that the search for forgotten memories had already become a race against someone determined to keep the past buried forever. 3 days later, Harbor Clinic received an invitation that surprised everyone. Blackwell Holdings requested an independent financial consultant to review the accounting records of one of its charitable medical foundations before the company's annual audit. Dr. Nolan Pierce looked over the official letter before handing it to Caleb. "You are the best person for this," he said. "You already know how nonprofit medical accounts work better than anyone here." Caleb stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. Adrian Blackwell. The signature was firm and elegant, yet completely unfamiliar in spirit because the man who had written it no longer remembered why protecting charitable clinics had once mattered so much to him. Caleb hesitated. Walking back into Adrian's world meant risking everything he had spent months trying to protect. But if he wanted answers, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The following afternoon, Caleb arrived at Blackwell Manor overlooking the rocky coastline outside Portland. The estate was impressive without appearing excessive, built from gray stone and surrounded by towering evergreens that swayed gently beneath the ocean breeze. Security staff escorted him through quiet hallways decorated with modern artwork and shelves filled with history books rather than expensive trophies. It reminded Caleb of the home Adrian had once dreamed of building after leaving the constant pressures of leadership behind. Some dreams had survived the accident even if the memories connected to them had disappeared. Adrian waited inside a spacious conference room overlooking the water. He stood as Caleb entered, offering the same respectful professionalism he would have shown any consultant. "Thank you for accepting the assignment, Mr. Monroe." Caleb nodded politely. "Thank you for trusting our clinic." Adrian gestured towards several financial binders arranged neatly across the conference table. "Victor insists on reviewing every charitable account before the annual board meeting. He suggested bringing in an outside specialist to verify everything independently." Caleb glanced briefly toward Victor, who sat quietly near the far end of the room with a pleasant smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Transparency is always a wise investment," Caleb replied. Adrian studied him again. That strange feeling returned immediately. Caleb's calm voice carried an almost comforting familiarity that settled somewhere beyond memory. As they reviewed invoices together, Caleb noticed several foundation accounts had been reorganized shortly after Adrian's accident. The changes appeared ordinary on the surface, but certain authorization codes had vanished entirely. Someone had carefully rewritten financial history without leaving obvious traces. Adrian leaned closer to examine one spreadsheet. Their hands briefly reached toward the same document. Neither actually touched the other, yet the simple closeness sent another sharp pulse of recognition through Adrian's thoughts. A faint image flashed across his mind. Warm sunlight. Laughter. Someone placing a handwritten budget across a kitchen table while teasing him about overspending on fresh flowers. The image disappeared before he could grasp it. Adrian pressed 2 fingers gently against the scar behind his ear. "Are you all right?" Caleb asked before he could stop himself. Adrian looked up, surprised by the genuine concern in Caleb's voice. "Just another headache." Victor immediately stood. "You should take a break, Adrian." Dr. Evans specifically warned against overexertion. Caleb quietly returned his attention to the financial records, but he noticed something else. One folder near Victor's chair contained older authorization forms marked confidential. As Victor stepped away to answer a telephone call, the folder shifted slightly open. Caleb caught a glimpse of a copied memorandum carrying his own initials beside a bold red notation. Subject considered security risk. He felt the air leave his lungs. Before he could read another line, Victor calmly returned and closed the folder with practiced ease. "Old compliance paperwork," Victor explained pleasantly. "Nothing related to today's audit." Adrian looked between them, sensing the sudden tension. "Is something wrong?" Victor answered before Caleb could speak. "Not at all. Some former associates attempted to exploit your generosity before the accident. We simply became more cautious afterward." Caleb remained silent, but every instinct told him the document had not been placed there by coincidence. Someone wanted Adrian to associate Caleb with danger before any forgotten truth had the chance to return. As the meeting ended, Adrian walked Caleb to the front entrance himself. The evening sun reflected across the ocean, casting long golden light over the stone steps. Just before Caleb reached his car, Adrian spoke quietly. "This may sound strange, but every time you leave, it feels like I have forgotten something important again." Caleb forced himself to smile despite the ache in his chest. Sometimes the truth needs more than memory to find its way home. Adrian watched him drive away, repeating those words silently until they settled somewhere deep inside him, in a place untouched by fear, untouched by manipulation, and perhaps not entirely untouched by love. The following week began with an uneasy calm that felt almost too perfect to trust. Harbor Clinic returned to its familiar rhythm as children laughed in the waiting room. Elderly neighbors exchanged stories over coffee, and the steady sound of medical equipment blended with the distant cry of seagulls outside. Caleb tried to focus on patient records, but his thoughts remained trapped inside Blackwell Manor. Adrian's quiet confession at the front steps echoed through his mind again and again. It was not memory that had reached for him. It was something deeper, something no accident had completely erased. That fragile hope made every passing hour feel both comforting and dangerous. Shortly before noon, Dr. Nolan Pierce asked Caleb to organize several prenatal files before an ultrasound appointment scheduled later that afternoon. Caleb smiled softly as he reviewed the familiar paperwork. Every new appointment reminded him that the little life growing inside him deserved a future built on truth instead of fear. He rested his hand gently against his sweater as the child shifted with a tiny movement that never failed to make him smile. Across town, Adrian ended a board meeting earlier than expected. While Victor continued discussing investment reports with the executive committee, Adrian found his attention drifting back toward Harbor Clinic. The unexplained pull he felt whenever Caleb was nearby refused to disappear. Finally he stood, excused himself politely, and instructed his driver to change destinations. Victor noticed the change immediately. "The afternoon schedule is already full," he reminded him. Adrian calmly buttoned his coat. "This will not take long." Victor offered no objection, but his expression tightened almost imperceptibly as Adrian left the conference room. Less than 40 minutes later, Adrian stepped quietly into Harbor Clinic once again. The receptionist greeted him warmly before directing him toward Dr. Pierce's office. As he crossed the hallway, a sudden burst of raised voices echoed from the storage wing. 2 delivery workers were arguing after several supply boxes had accidentally toppled across the floor. Nurses hurried to help reorganize the scattered equipment while reassuring nearby patients that everything was under control. It was a minor disturbance, but enough to interrupt the clinic's peaceful routine. Caleb immediately joined the staff, carefully checking that nothing important had been damaged. Adrian instinctively moved forward as well, helping lift several lightweight containers away from the hallway without hesitation. Dr. Pierce thanked everyone before inviting Caleb into the examination room for his scheduled ultrasound. Adrian intended to continue toward the consultation offices, but the partially open door allowed the gentle sound of the monitor to drift into the hallway. A rapid, steady heartbeat filled the quiet corridor. The sound stopped Adrian in his tracks. He had heard thousands of ordinary sounds since the accident. None had ever reached him like this one. Something deep inside him responded before logic could intervene. He remained standing outside the doorway, unable to explain why his chest suddenly felt impossibly tight. Inside the room, Caleb watched the small image appear on the monitor while Dr. Pierce smiled warmly. "Everything looks healthy," the doctor said. "Your baby is growing exactly as expected." Caleb's eyes filled with quiet relief. "Thank you." The tiny heartbeat continued echoing through the speakers, filling the room with a rhythm that somehow felt larger than the walls surrounding it. Adrian unknowingly stepped closer. The sound stirred another brief fragment hidden beneath the silence inside his mind. A memory without faces. A promise spoken beside soft laughter. A quiet voice saying, "One day we will hear our child's heartbeat together." The image vanished before he could reach it, leaving only an overwhelming sense of loss. Dr. Pierce noticed Adrian standing outside and opened the door with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Blackwell, I did not realize you were here." Adrian looked embarrassed by his own hesitation. "I apologize. I did not mean to interrupt." Caleb turned toward the doorway. Their eyes met once again, but this time Adrian's expression held something new. Not recognition, not yet, but an unmistakable tenderness he could neither understand nor hide. His gaze drifted briefly toward Caleb's gently rounded stomach before returning to Caleb's face. "I hope everything is well," Adrian said quietly. "It is," Caleb answered with equal softness. "Thank you." Victor arrived moments later, his footsteps measured and controlled. His eyes moved from Adrian to the ultrasound room, and then to Caleb. Although his smile remained perfectly composed, calculation flickered behind it. "We should leave," Victor said. "There are people waiting for you." Adrian did not answer immediately. He continued looking toward Caleb for one lingering moment before speaking without taking his eyes away. "Please make certain no one causes unnecessary trouble for this clinic. If they ever require assistance, my office will provide it." Victor's smile froze for the briefest instant. "Of course," he replied smoothly. As Adrian finally turned to leave, the tiny heartbeat still echoed faintly behind him. He could not explain why it felt strangely familiar, only that for the first time since losing his memories, protecting one quiet clinic by the ocean suddenly felt more important than any meeting waiting for him back in the city. For the next several days, Caleb found himself living between hope and caution. Adrian's unexpected concern for the clinic had quietly changed everything. New medical equipment arrived without explanation. Repairs that had been delayed for months were suddenly approved. Anonymous donations continued appearing in the foundation account, each transfer carefully documented yet impossible to trace beyond Blackwell Holdings. Adrian never visited in person during those few days, but his quiet protection could be felt in every corner of the little clinic. Caleb appreciated the help, yet another question refused to leave his mind. If Adrian's instincts still guided him toward the people he once loved, then what had truly happened on the night of the accident? Late one evening after the last patient left, Caleb remained alone in the accounting office with the encrypted drive he had created from the trust records. Harper placed a sandwich beside his keyboard before leaving him to work. "Do not stay all night," she reminded him gently. Caleb smiled. "Just one more hour." As darkness settled outside, he compared authorization codes from the trust with archived security records that Dr. Pierce had legally obtained during the clinic's annual compliance review. Hours passed before a tiny inconsistency finally caught his attention. A timestamp connected to one financial authorization did not match the official corporate log. Someone had manually edited the digital records several hours after Adrian personally approved the transfer. Caleb immediately searched deeper through backup files that most auditors never examined. Hidden inside an overlooked archive was a damaged security recording automatically preserved by the accounting server. The video quality was poor, but enough remained to reconstruct portions of the final evening before Adrian's accident. Caleb carefully restored the corrupted file frame by frame. The screen flickered before revealing Adrian sitting alone inside his private office. He looked exhausted, yet completely focused. Several folders lay open across his desk. Caleb recognized one immediately. It contained the same trust documents he had discovered days earlier. Adrian signed the final authorization before speaking into his office recorder. The audio was distorted, but several sentences remained clear. If anything happens, this trust belongs to Caleb. Keep him safe. Our child deserves. Static swallowed the remaining words. Caleb froze. His heart pounded so loudly that he almost missed the next sequence. Adrian stood quickly after receiving a phone call. Although no audio survived, his expression changed from calm determination to urgent concern. He collected a small envelope, slipped it into his coat, and hurried out of the office. The recording continued from another hallway camera. Several minutes later, Victor appeared. He looked around carefully before entering Adrian's now empty office. He remained inside only a short time before leaving with nothing visible in his hands. Yet the system log recorded that someone had accessed Adrian's secured files less than 10 minutes after he left. Caleb barely slept after discovering the recovered security recordings. Every new piece of evidence strengthened one truth, while raising an even more dangerous question. If Victor had manipulated Adrian's financial records before the accident, what else had been carefully hidden during the months that followed? The encrypted drive remained locked inside the clinic's secure cabinet, while Caleb made several additional copies, storing each one in a different location. He had learned long ago that the safest place for the truth was never in only one pair of hands. 2 mornings later, an unexpected invitation arrived from Blackwell Holdings. Adrian requested a private review of the foundation audit before presenting it to the executive board. The meeting would take place at the manor that afternoon. Caleb hesitated only briefly before accepting. This time he was no longer walking into Blackwell Manor searching for answers. He was carrying them. The ocean was calm when Caleb arrived, sunlight reflecting across the water beyond the stone terraces surrounding the estate. Adrian greeted him personally at the entrance without waiting for security staff. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely. "I trust your judgment more than anyone who has reviewed these reports." Caleb noticed Victor watching from the second-floor balcony before quietly disappearing inside. Every instinct warned him that the man already suspected something had changed. They spent nearly an hour examining financial statements together. Caleb deliberately guided Adrian through several inconsistencies without immediately revealing his conclusions. Adrian listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions that reflected the strategic mind he had always possessed, even if his memories remained fractured. "These authorization dates do not match," Adrian observed while comparing 2 reports. "Someone altered the sequence." Caleb nodded. "That was my conclusion as well." Adrian looked up slowly. "Do you believe it was accidental?" Caleb met his eyes. "No. I believe someone wanted certain records to tell a different story." Silence settled between them. Adrian closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Ever since I met you, I have begun questioning things I accepted without hesitation for almost a year. I cannot explain why." Caleb reached into his briefcase and removed a single printed page from the recovered trust records. He placed it gently on the table without speaking. Adrian picked it up. His own signature stared back at him beneath the handwritten instruction. "Protect what matters most." His fingers tightened around the paper. A sudden rush of emotions swept through him. Warm sunlight across a kitchen window. A gentle laugh. The scent of fresh bread. Someone smiling while placing a hand over his own. The images vanished almost instantly, but they lasted longer than any previous fragment. Adrian closed his eyes as another sharp ache spread behind the old scar. "Who was I protecting?" he asked quietly. Caleb answered with complete honesty. "Someone you loved enough to plan an entirely different future." Before Adrian could ask another question, the conference room doors opened. Victor entered carrying another folder. His expression remained composed until he noticed the trust document resting beside Adrian's hand. For the first time, genuine surprise crossed his face. It disappeared almost immediately beneath his familiar professional smile. "I apologize for interrupting," Victor said smoothly. "The board members have arrived earlier than expected." Adrian did not immediately respond. Instead, he continued looking at Caleb. Something inside him had shifted. He still could not remember their shared past, but every instinct insisted Caleb had never been his enemy. Quite the opposite. Trust came naturally around him in a way Adrian could neither justify nor ignore. Finally, Adrian stood and spoke with calm certainty. "From this moment forward, Mr. Monroe will have unrestricted access to every charitable financial record within Blackwell Holdings. Victor's smile became almost imperceptibly strained. That may expose confidential corporate information. Adrian answered without raising his voice. Then adjust the permissions accordingly. I want complete transparency. Victor inclined his head politely, but disappointment flickered briefly across his expression before disappearing again. As the meeting concluded, Adrian walked Caleb toward the entrance once more. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of the ocean through the evergreen trees. Adrian stopped beside the front steps and looked directly at Caleb. I still do not remember my past, he admitted. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. Caleb waited silently. Adrian continued, his voice steady and unmistakably sincere. Whatever happened before my accident, I do not believe you ever betrayed me. Until I learn the truth, you have my trust. Caleb felt emotion rise into his throat. He had spent months believing memory alone would bring Adrian home. Instead, the first bridge back had been built through choice. Neither of them noticed Victor standing behind the second-floor window, watching every word exchanged below. His carefully constructed story was beginning to fracture, and for the first time since the accident, he understood that Adrian was no longer following the path that had been planned for him. The trust Adrian had placed in Caleb changed the balance far more quickly than either of them realized. Within 24 hours, encrypted access to Blackwell Holdings' charitable accounts allowed Caleb to compare records that had never before existed in the same system. Sitting inside a quiet office at Harbor Clinic long after sunset, he surrounded himself with spreadsheets, transaction histories, archived emails, and authorization logs. Numbers began revealing a story that words had carefully concealed for nearly a year. Every altered record pointed toward the same pattern. Funds intended for charitable foundations had been quietly redirected through temporary holding companies before returning to their original destinations with modified approval dates. The money itself had never disappeared, which explained why routine audits found nothing suspicious. Instead, the timeline had been rewritten. Whoever controlled the records had not stolen wealth. They had buried history. Caleb understood why. If investigators only examined financial losses, they would never discover someone had erased evidence connected to Adrian's final decisions before the accident. Using his accounting experience, Caleb created a detailed comparison chart showing every altered timestamp beside the untouched server backups recovered from Harbor Clinic. The discrepancies formed an unmistakable sequence leading directly to the hours before Adrian's accident. Harper quietly entered the office carrying warm soup and stopped in amazement as she looked across the wall Caleb had covered with printed timelines connected by colored notes. "You found it," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "Not everything, but enough to prove someone rewrote the official history." He carefully encrypted the completed evidence package before sending identical copies to 3 independent legal auditors who routinely supervised nonprofit medical foundations. None of them knew one another, ensuring the information could not disappear if a single source became compromised. At Blackwell Manor, Adrian spent the evening reviewing board documents when an unexpected notification appeared on his secure tablet. The independent auditors had requested clarification regarding historical authorization changes inside Blackwell Holdings. Adrian frowned. He had never received questions like this before. He immediately opened the attached comparison report. As he studied the side-by-side timelines, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. Caleb had been right. Someone had deliberately reorganized official records after the accident. Adrian quietly closed the report and requested a complete executive meeting for the following morning. When Victor received the same notification minutes later, the calm confidence he had maintained for months finally began to crack. He understood exactly what the auditors had discovered. The altered timestamps were impossible to justify once compared against multiple independent backups. Before dawn, Victor contacted several trusted associates, hoping to delay the review by arguing that confidential restructuring projects explained the discrepancies. Unfortunately for him, the evidence Caleb assembled relied entirely on original server archives and legally preserved audit logs rather than personal accusations. Facts were becoming more powerful than influence. The next morning, Adrian welcomed the auditors into the main conference room overlooking the ocean. Caleb attended as an external consultant together with Dr. Nolan Pierce, whose clinic records had preserved several untouched financial backups. Victor remained composed throughout the presentation, occasionally offering alternative explanations for the inconsistencies. Yet each response created another contradiction that Caleb calmly addressed using documented evidence instead of speculation. The atmosphere inside the room remained respectful, but the growing silence carried unmistakable weight. Adrian watched Caleb explain complex financial structures with remarkable patience and precision. There was no anger in his voice, no desire for revenge, only an unwavering commitment to the truth. The quiet wisdom Caleb displayed stirred another powerful wave of unfamiliar familiarity inside Adrian. Suddenly, a fragmented memory surfaced with greater clarity than ever before. He saw himself sitting across from Caleb at a wooden kitchen table covered with household budgets and future plans. Caleb laughed gently after correcting one of Adrian's calculations before saying, "The strongest foundation is the one built honestly, because you never have to remember which lie you told." Adrian blinked as the memory disappeared, leaving behind one sentence echoing with startling clarity. Honest foundations. His breathing slowed. He looked across the conference table toward Caleb, whose calm expression remained unchanged despite the pressure surrounding him. In that moment, Adrian understood something memory alone had failed to teach him. Even without remembering their shared life, the man before him was still guiding him toward the truth exactly as he once had. And somewhere beneath years of confusion and carefully hidden deception, the path leading home had begun opening one honest step at a time. The conference room remained silent long after the final auditor finished reviewing the evidence. No one rushed to speak because every document on the table told the same story. Original server archives, preserved financial logs, independent compliance records, and Adrian's own handwritten authorizations all pointed toward one undeniable conclusion. The official history surrounding the months after the accident had been quietly rewritten. The lead auditor finally closed the last folder and looked toward Adrian with measured professionalism. There is no evidence that charitable funds were stolen. However, there is clear evidence that historical records were intentionally altered after your accident. We recommend a complete internal investigation supervised by an independent review board. Adrian nodded slowly. That recommendation will be implemented immediately. He then turned toward Victor, whose calm confidence had finally given way to visible uncertainty. Effective today, you are relieved of all authority over financial operations until the review is complete. Victor attempted to respond, insisting there had been reasonable explanations for every administrative decision, but Adrian gently raised one hand. The review will determine the facts. Until then, transparency comes first. No one argued further. The meeting ended quietly, with the auditors collecting their files while board members remained deep in thought. Outside the manor, the afternoon sky had cleared into brilliant blue. Caleb stepped onto the stone terrace overlooking the ocean, grateful that the truth no longer rested on his shoulders alone. A few moments later, Adrian joined him. Neither of them spoke immediately. Waves rolled steadily against the shoreline below, carrying the peaceful rhythm that had first drawn Caleb to Harbor Clinic months earlier. Adrian rested his hands lightly on the stone railing before looking toward the horizon. "I spent almost a year believing that memory alone would tell me who I used to be," he said softly. "Today I realized character survives even when memory does not." Caleb smiled gently. "That is why I never stopped believing in you." Adrian turned toward him, studying his face with quiet wonder. "There is still so much I cannot remember." Caleb nodded. "I know." Adrian's eyes lowered briefly toward Caleb's gently rounded stomach before lifting again. This time there was no confusion in his expression, only sincerity. "The recordings you recovered," he said carefully. "The trust, the promises I made. They all point toward one truth I have been too afraid to ask." Caleb waited patiently. Adrian took a slow breath. "Is that child mine?" Tears gathered in Caleb's eyes, but his smile never faded. "Yes. You planned a future for both of us before the accident because you wanted our child to grow up far away from fear." Adrian closed his eyes as emotion swept quietly through him. Another memory surfaced, stronger than any before. He saw Caleb standing beside the ocean at sunset, placing Adrian's hand against a tiny heartbeat while whispering, "No matter what happens, We will always find our way back. The memory remained only a few seconds before fading once more, yet this time it left something behind. Not certainty, not complete recollection. Hope. Adrian opened his eyes and stepped closer. I still cannot remember every day we shared, he admitted. But I remember how it feels to trust you. Somehow my heart never forgot what my mind lost. Caleb reached for Adrian's hand. Adrian accepted it without hesitation. The simple gesture felt astonishingly familiar to them both. Several months later, a small white house overlooking the same coastline welcomed its newest resident. Sunlight poured through wide windows while laughter filled rooms once occupied only by silence. Adrian had chosen to reduce his role inside Blackwell Holdings, placing independent oversight over every charitable foundation and restructuring the organization around the principles he and Caleb had once planned together. Harbor Clinic expanded with new equipment and additional medical staff, serving families throughout the coastal region. Every weekend, Adrian, Caleb, Harper, and Dr. Nolan shared dinner together while the newest member of the family slept peacefully nearby. Adrian's memories continued returning in small pieces rather than all at once. Some mornings he remembered a favorite recipe. Other days he recalled a walk along the beach or a quiet conversation beneath the stars. Caleb never rushed the process. He understood that healing was measured not by how quickly the past returned, but by how faithfully they built the future together. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the Pacific Ocean, Adrian gently lifted his child into his arms before looking toward Caleb with grateful eyes. I thought I had forgotten the way home, he said quietly. Caleb smiled as the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt, cedar, and new beginnings through the open windows. Home was never a place you had to remember, he answered. It was always the people who kept waiting for you to find it again. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.